So, Ken Carson is an artist that has easily had one of the most unique but inspiring come-ups in the underground to date. Having been involved in the scene for almost his entire life, but only recently gaining traction due to the role he's played in developing one of the most popular sounds used over the last couple of years. But his sound and aesthetic, along with his life and character pretty much as a whole, most definitely didn't start out this way. So firstly, let's dive into where did Ken Carson start? Born April 11th in the year 2000, originally being born on the west side of Atlanta, but then later relocating to the south side. Most of Ken's early years are spent like most kids around his age, having heavy interest in the WWE, along with some of the different animes, mangas, and cartoon shows that would pique his interest throughout his childhood. Namely being series like The Boondocks, Danganronpa, Death Note, and most obviously the X-Men comics, which as I'm sure most of us are aware would end up becoming a pretty huge part of Ken's branding later into his career, with the X-Men logo being a staple of Ken's marketing even nowadays. But aside from purely entertainment, Ken's household growing up was surrounded by primarily rap, which naturally would lead Ken to gaining interest in artists like Soulja Boy, Lil Wayne, and even early mixtape era Future, which are a lot of influences that could be seen in his style even nowadays. But moving further along, Ken's personality and influences sadly wouldn't lend themselves well to the school system. Because according to Ken's interview he did with Montreality, by just 10 years old he was already getting into fights, but instead of it being with students, it was with teachers.
I slapped my teacher when I was 10. I slapped my teacher when I was 10. I was like, come here, I gotta tell you something. Man, I got in trouble for that.
But fast forwarding and going into Ken's teen years, he would go on to open up his first official Twitter account under the handle of @PimpCarson in March of 2014. And in the same year, he would also end up changing his career practically forever. Maybe slightly dramatic, but going into 8th grade, Ken was starting to become close with one of the girls attending his same middle school and would eventually find out that this same girl was close friends with a now producer known as Lil 88. And due to, at the time, both Ken and Lil 88 sharing very common interests, they would start to become closer, which would eventually lead to a Facetime call where Ken would find out that Lil 88 happened to be cousins with a very well-known and respected producer in the scene named TM88, which nowadays is most well known for his production on Lil Uzi's breakout record being EXO Tour Life. But even at a young age, Ken would realize the opportunity in front of him, and upon finding that out, he would then visit TM88 that same day to showcase some of his own music he was working on at the time, which I guess seemed to have impressed TM88 enough to introduce Ken to 808 Mafia's co-founder being Southside, who himself has a near endless amount of just massive placements on records such as Kodak Black's Tunnel Vision, 21 Savage's No Heart, and the list truly keeps going. But these kind of connections would also work very heavily in Ken's favor, with Ken having a large pool of inspiration and even in-studio experience, with Ken naturally being around artists the likes of Young Thug, Travis Scott, and even Playboi Carti, which is a relationship we'll dive more into later. But rewinding just a bit and continuing further into Ken's schooling years, in 2015, at the age of 15, he would end up dropping out of public schooling and then transferring into military school, in which he would only complete 3 out of the 6 months required due to him getting caught up while FaceTiming some of the hoes, which obviously led to him getting kicked out. But due to Ken already being so heavily engaged in the music scene, he would take this as a chance to get his GED at only 15 years old and then slowly start to chase after his passion, being fashion.
Don't be a judge, bro.
But moving steadily into 2016, he would end up creating one of his earliest currently available Instagram accounts under the handle of @Boy Barbie Carson, and would also around the same time period get pretty heavily into party culture, with him first starting to experiment with different drugs, along with him just releasing videos at these packed out parties he would be at, which was all paired along with his Twitter, where he would just post some funny videos of him smacking these random 40-year-old moms in the I'd just watch. But all around the same time period, Ken was starting to get pretty heavily into Playboi Carti's music, and as mentioned earlier, had even had an offhand interaction before with Carti at one of his studio sessions hosted by Southside over in Atlanta, which in turn would lead to Ken while out in LA to go to one of Carti's shows, which was going smoothly up until he got into a fight with someone in the crowd, which led to Ken getting kicked out of that show. But thankfully, being that Carti remembered Ken due to their interaction beforehand at the studio, he was allowed a wristband and got back in directly from Carti, which however small it was, it still would kickstart the beginning of their relationship together. But all the while Ken was going back and forth between LA and Atlanta, he was really starting to experiment and fully gain interest in making music, and would eventually go on to upload his first ever fully available track called 32. And this track would end up getting reposted by a page called Rap Direct, which would also lead to Ken getting his first ever official blog post or write-up over on their website, which sadly nowadays has been lost due to something we'll talk about very shortly. But skipping forward and heading into 2017, this year was mostly a quiet one, but it did showcase Ken starting to explore further into fashion, good or bad, posting Rick Owen and CDG pickups alongside some of his more questionable outfits. But still, this year would end up being pretty important considering that towards the end of this year, he would end up doing one of his first ever shows in Atlanta thanks to TM88. But if you're curious on how there would even be enough music to perform, being that at this time we're only aware of one track that nowadays has been lost, it's mostly thanks to Ken Carson's ex-girlfriend. That, as Ken Carson puts in his interview with OGM, ended up with her deleting his original SoundCloud account due to him messing around behind her back. Which nowadays, if you were to find his original SoundCloud, it instead links off to a page called Giordano, which has sadly since gone inactive. But fast forwarding a bit into 2018, there's still a fair amount of different singles up from this time period today, such as his singles with Young Jordan called Fan Behavior, or his other singles with or produced by both TM88 and Southside like with Fallback. And the most notable of these singles released around the same time period would end up being a single called Fold, which would pick up a heavy amount of traction online and lead to further interviews on websites like Respect, where Ken details his plans for the future, along with being affiliated with a distribution team called Caroline, which would actually play a huge role in the push and popularity of this exact single. And if you're more interested in his work pre-2020, I'll link a curated playlist by @couple1000 on Instagram or Isaac on SoundCloud that has a lot of his earlier singles and leaks if you're kind of interested in that, side. But for 2019, this year would kick off with arguably one of the most important early factors of what makes Ken Ken: lies. He would first post on Twitter with the cover art of his first official tape being called Boy Barbie, featuring 10 different singles with only one feature being from the artist named earlier called Young Jordan. And along with this post, he would then caption it saying it would be dropping that March, which would make its release only 1 month away from its original date it was tweeted. And it would end up dropping, but only over a year later with 4 less singles and a completely redesigned track list, which means that over 9 different singles aside from Geeked Up have now just been lost to time. However, I can say with a fair amount of certainty that the reason for this long of a delay is almost certainly due to Playboi Carti. You see, around the same time period, Ken and Carti had really started to form a strong relationship, being at multiple studio sessions together, along with Ken releasing photos within that next year showing the two together posted in a hotel. Which, although at this time it was somewhat unofficial, it would eventually segue into the formation of what we all now know as Opium, with its branding starting to appear in different music videos later on, and Ken most notably heavily changing his approach to social media, with Ken starting to become more separated from media and instead allowing himself to be more quote-unquote rare, which in a way separated him from others that were emerging from a scene that was more based around personality and antics rather than just purely image, which was probably heavily guided by someone in his close circle, Kafka, But as far as 2019 goes music-wise, it would most notably feature the release of his currently oldest available single on his official SoundCloud being called Free Dro, produced by, obviously, Mexico Dro, which if you're somehow completely unaware is the producer known for producing a legendary plug record called Broke Boy, who also at the same time was coming out of the prison system due to some charges. But overall, as a whole, this year would mostly close off as a preparation year for arguably the most important year to come, being 2020. And this year, as mentioned, would kick off pretty heavily with Ken tweeting out pictures with both Lancey Foe and obviously Playboi Carti, which would naturally start to build talk around his name up until the full release of his project teased earlier called Boy Barbie, which would end up finally being released on April 16th of 2020, being only 6 tracks long and featuring appearances from artists like Lil Yachty, International Jefe, Lil Unky, and obviously Lancey Foe, which Ken mentions in an interview with OGM came about simply due to Lancey liking Opium. And as far as reviewing this project goes, this isn't the worst project that Ken's dropped in my opinion, but it's also not a project that I see myself coming back to necessarily. Aside from the appearances from Lancey throughout this project, this tape lacks really any of the catchiness or energy that Ken brings nowadays, so overall this project lands at a 4.5 out of 10. Not a bad first tape, but yeah. But this really was only the beginning of 2020 and would slowly transition us into his next project called Teen X. This project would be teased through both Instagram lives and Twitter snippets through its soon-to-be breakout single, Yale. But this project off the jump was notable due to its whole recording process being done in between the studio sessions, from Carti's next big release being Whole Lotta Red. And not only that, but being that Ken was heavily a part of the Whole Lotta Red sessions, he would also end up getting production credits on track 7 of that project called Beno, named after Opium and Homicide gang member Homicide Beno. And this also happens to be the most Ken Carson-esque instrumental, considering that he did it alongside both Outta Town and Starboy, which are producers that would later go on to be a very, very key part of Ken Carson's career going forward. But diving back into Teen X, this project would end up fully releasing on August 13th of 2020. It would also really set in motion Ken Carson's career, mainly due in part to Yale and how quickly it would garner numbers, alongside its own music video that dropped only one day after the project's release. And this project overall was a huge step up quality-wise, with the production from both Outta Town and Starboy just being top tier, along with these songs having a pretty high amount of replay value, paired along with the mix taking a big step up and Ken also starting to understand how to make use of his voice, which all put together puts this project at a 5.5 out of 10, which might seem low after all the praise I gave it, but that's mostly due to the deluxe edition of this same project showing us how much better this sound can get. But moving us quickly into 2021, coming off the build-up for Carti's Whole Lotta Red, which around this time had just released and was starting to settle in with the listeners with mixed reviews, Ken would end up dropping a 6-pack of what Ken himself calls throwaways from the previous tape, Teen X, which would release on January 20th of 2021, with the 4-song Stuck featuring Lil Yachty being released a day later. And then 3 days after that, Ken would end up releasing 2 more songs with No Love and Fuck Shit, which would all be a part of his currently first available Lost Files. And I'll be honest, I don't like this project at all. Mostly due to Ken giving us his worst mixing and energy yet, which sucks because a lot of the instrumentals on here are really solid, but Ken just really doesn't pull through. So sadly, overall, I'm putting this at a 3.5 out of 10. Just really not for me. And coming almost directly off the back of Lost Files, he would then end up quickly releasing his next project only 10 days later on January 30th of 2021, titled as Teen X Relapsed, which, as you could guess, was the deluxe edition to the original Teen X, and this album is just better in so many different ways. From flows into energy, this tape really just polishes his original sound and would also slowly start to build its own wave, with Ken Carson type beats gaining their first peak in popularity, which wouldn't really be fully realized until his next project released a little later this year. But overall, this project was a huge step in the right direction and would push Ken's sound forward as an artist overall, so 7 out of 10. Really worth the time. But coming some months after his last release with some music videos, promos, interviews, and like always, Twitter, he would end up dropping Glock 19 1 month before he would officially release the second installment in his Lost Files series on July 10th of 2021. And in comparison to the first Lost Files, this one sees a pretty big step up. A lot of the downfalls of Lost Files get taken care of, mostly due to Ken's mix and delivery being a lot more modern and well done here, alongside some of the different singles off this tape having a massive amount of replay value, like with the previously mentioned Glock 19 and also Teen Bean, which was also a single that would see pretty huge success over on TikTok, temporarily going viral and giving Ken a nice boost in listeners. But overall, for a rating, this project is a 6.5 out of 10. Although I could see an argument being made for it being on par with Relapsed, but great project. But after a long while of Ken staying consistent, dropping his 5 to 8 song tapes, he then promised to soon be releasing first his final EP and then later his debut album. But it didn't work out like that. Just try to keep up with this timeline of just confusing lies. Firstly, we start by going back before even the release of Lost Files 2 to where this so-called final EP would be first announced on February 4th of 2021 in a now deleted Twitter post, from which then later on March 9th of that year would be fully revealed on Twitter that Project X, the EP, would now be releasing on his birthday, being April 11th of 2021. Which then came his birthday, where he acts like nothing happened and instead promised that yet again Project X would just be an EP, and he also assured us that it would be the final one before his debut album. However, after his birthday passed by with 0 updates, he would then later come out on record in his 2021 interview with High Society, where he revealed that the project had become his debut album. It would now instead be released in August of 2021, which again never happened. But soon enough, Project X, after a long while of both teasers and lies, would be fully released only 13 days after his last release of Lost Files 2 on July 23rd of 2021. And this project features obvious inspiration on the cover art from the movie under the same name, being Project X, which he states in an interview relates back to his earlier teen days of partying, and he also states that he mainly wanted to make a project that could be used as a soundtrack for that exact movie, in which we got Project X. And to summarize my review, this project just perfectly captures Ken's sound and aesthetic as an artist almost flawlessly, and really showcases what I would consider to be Ken's most refined sound just yet. And overall, both financially and career-wise, this project was just a massive success, and is honestly just one of my personal favorites in this genre as a whole, which lands it at an 8.5 out of 10. That's the quick summary. But it was obviously a lot of other artists' favorites as well, because this project would almost single-handedly spawn a massive wave of these just hyperpop, rage Ken Carson type beats that multiple different artists in the scene would hop on and give their take on. And this surge in a new sound was shown pretty heavily throughout the scene, to the point where nowadays it's already being recognized as being pretty overused and repetitive as a whole sound, which actually overall ends up having a pretty negative impact on Ken Carson's career later down the line, but more on that later. Now, coming off the back of his release of Project X, he would next end up tweeting out teasing the release of its deluxe version under the name of Project Xtended, which would originally be set to release on Halloween of that year. And guess what? I know you won't believe me, but it never ended up happening. It was instead turned into a project that wouldn't release for literally a little under a year. Actually, no, exactly a year. Or actually never really, because it's a different deluxe for a different project, but I don't... shit. But even so, with his last release receiving such a large amount of love from both TikTok and streaming services, with his numbers jumping pretty drastically with the months following its release, his next move would be naturally to give the fans an in-between tape, which would end up being Lost Files 3. Released January 29th of 2022, this tape would originally be uploaded and hosted by a brand called Born From Pain Sicko, also known as simply Sicko over on SoundCloud, and would come in at 10 tracks in length, or 11 if you consider the song Walk Heart featuring Offset, which was originally released alongside these tracks but never officially included in the track list. But as a whole, this project hits the mark yet again. Although some deliveries that Ken tries on here kind of land flat, like with both Shoot and Are You Serious? But that still gets pretty heavily outweighed by just how much energy and just how good tracks like Raver, Gang, and Murda Music bring. Or are, I don't know, yeah. Long night. But overall, this project for me lands at a 7 out of 10. And it's actually personally my favorite Lost Files. Now next, we have a speculative project, or fully released depending on how you want to think about it, being Lost Files 3.5, or also known as X23, or X23. A lot of different names. This was never officially released, but was allegedly leaked by Ken himself around June of this year, due to some issues outside of our knowledge, or maybe some kind of Opium label kind of, it could be a marketing scheme too, for all we know. Which if it was, ended up working, because a lot of these tracks would end up going pretty damn viral over on TikTok, like with X for Breakfast, Aquafina, and X Games. But aside from that, this project goes 10 tracks in length and overall just has insanely solid features coming from both Lil Tecca and Sofego, alongside obviously Destroy Lonely. And this project has its high points, but it's also got definitely some lower points, I would say. Some of the fillers kind of weighing this project down, but then again, it is a throwaway project, and as a throwaway project, it's kind of exactly what you want. So for me, it lands at a 6 out of 10. I guess Ken just knows his marketing. Okay, so now finally we have one last goose chase left, which revolves around Ken's most recent full release, being X. Starting out originally on August 21st of 2021, Ken would originally share that this next project would be self-titled and just named as Ken Carson. But as the project went through more delays, the name was eventually changed to X-Man, which then later on May 7th of 2022, Ken claimed that he had officially finished and turned in the album, which would contain a total of 18 songs. And he would also announce that The End would be the lead single for this project and would release on May 9th of 2021. However, this yet again never came to fruition. But sure enough, a little under a month later, on June 4th of 2022, Ken would then tweet that 2 more songs were being added to the track list, which would lead up to our next and almost final update on June 27th of 2022, where a billboard was spotted confirming that the album would be fully releasing on July 8th. And after a small wait, Ken would then announce the project's full release himself, finally clearing up the rumors, which would then lead to July 5th, where the project's lead single, under the title The End, would be fully released later that day, which would finally build up enough hype for the project to be fully released as promised on July 8th of 2022. And overall, to summarize this project, it just doesn't do enough. As mentioned earlier, with the nature of Ken's sound, it was bound to get pretty old pretty quickly, which was only kicked further into gear by all the copycats or remixes that would end up dropping later into 2021, which paired alongside this project also having a lot of different filler tracks in between, and some songs that do sound pretty damn similar, it's kind of natural that this project would be subpar for a lot of its playtime. However, when it does hit, it really hits. Tracks like Freestyle 2, or others like Turn Up, Get Rich or Die, MDMA, and Delinquent, to name a few, really do hit. And I'd say this project definitely isn't as monumental of a miss as some people make it out to be, and I'd say it's aged pretty decently so far. So if I'm rating it personally, which obviously I am, it's gonna be a 6 out of 10. Not bad, but definitely could have been better. Now finally, we have the Halloween drop, or also known as Project Xtended. Releasing October 31st of 2022, this is a 5-track deluxe edition to the previously mentioned X. And this project does have a small history of drama built around the project's release, with Ken originally tweeting announcing the deluxe on October 11th of 2022, which then 9 days later would be followed up by Ken seemingly out of nowhere going on a small rant on Twitter, which was mainly regarding his history of lying about release dates and saying that he always pushes for music to release but has constant pushback from his label. Which, me personally, I don't really have a take on this since I'm not there, but hey, the project is here and it's pretty solid. This project has been receiving backlash due to its lead single, Freestyle 3, being mocked online for it not sounding exactly like the snippet, which I think people are just somehow confused about this song not sounding exactly like a snippet that was played on a car speaker on an IG Live with subwoofers getting picked up by Ken's Nintendo phone, all while Ken was just screaming random shit into the mic, which just kind of adds to the distortedness. It sounds fine to me. Which, aside from that, this project would also come with like 16 different jokes where random SoundCloud artists would remix the song and people would caption it with this. But overall, aside from just Freestyle 3, this project just feels better in certain areas revolving around flows and instrumentals, being overall just more creative and different than his regular style, or at least the style that he showcased on X. Although his deliveries and energy on certain tracks are either too much or too little. But I will give it some slack, this project is only dropped around 5 days ago or 3 days ago, depending on when you're, I don't know, it could be any time when you guys are watching this. So maybe further down the line I can appreciate this more, but for now, by rating only these 5 songs, this project lands at a 6.5 out of 10. Hits more than it misses, but it also doesn't really blow me away just yet. Video over. But before you leave, I got a couple things to say. Follow me on Instagram and especially Twitter to stay posted on YouTube updates, and if you have any questions, I'm usually open on there. Also, do your part and join my Discord to help stop it from dying, because I'm just inactive as fuck, but hey, maybe one day. And after you've done all that, thank you. I love you guys. I for real mean it. No YouTuber shit. I appreciate y'all. Thank you for rocking with me, and y'all have a good rest of y'all day. Bye.